All right, so as we begin this week to look at postmodern visual arts, it's important to keep in mind that there have been a lot of major shifts since the Renaissance, where we first began our journey. The Renaissance era, remember, about 1300 to 1600, and now here we are in the 1950s with postmodernism. So you can imagine a great deal has changed, and there has been a lot of shifts in thinking and the way people live during this time period. I mean, 350 years will certainly change you. When we look at postmodernism, it's important to first maybe take a little bit of a look at modernism and remember that. And in my lecture, Renaissance to Modernism to Postmodernism, you'll get to have just a really quick view of a few different kind of key aspects that happen along the way from Renaissance to modernism. But let's just revisit modernism really quick before we jump into this week's work and postmodernism, so we sort of know where we're coming from. So remember, in the modern era, we're interested in progress and in grand narratives and changing approaches, and the work itself took a lot of different aesthetic modes and looks quite different throughout those 350 years. A lot of exploration and technique and subject matter happened. But what we do see is a shift and a change from realistic depiction to exploring other sorts of images and ideas. One thing I want to remind you is that during this time we have the invention of photography, and this is a huge component of the changes in the visual arts, shifting from being responsible to their culture and their society for realistic depictions of people and individuals and spaces, to kind of freeing that up to being able to explore something outside of direct depiction in their paintings and in their work. So keep that in mind, not only as we look at the work from modernism, but also as we move into postmodernism, that just that one shift and that one change in technology and that one shift and change in what the responsibility of the artist was to the society in recording has changed so much. And so then the artist's responsibility and interest in the way that they navigate what they're supposed to be contributing through their work has changed a lot too. And remember just to go back through and watch that other video if you need some reminders on those shifts that happen. So let's move into postmodernism a little bit now. So we have a lot of challenging of these grand narratives, and we replace those grand narratives of modernism with what we'd call like micro narratives or local narratives or individual narratives. So that's, instead of focusing on these grand overarching ideas like religion, for example, we focus on individual experience or local or community experience. So I want you to look for evidence of reader response theory in the works, in the postmodern works this week. And specifically remember that part of that has to do with the idea that the artist creates something and that some of that meaning or all of that meaning is up to maybe you as the viewer to interpret. You as the viewer, as the person interacting with the work, gives the artwork meaning. And this happens, we'll talk about, in music and in theater, but it's quite different from the ideas of the Renaissance, where there was an intended audience and an intended purpose to a specific kind of work, whether to educate you in like a biblical story or something like that. Instead, we start to see a responsibility on the viewer or the interactor with the works, and having a part in telling what that piece means and kind of even creating that piece. Another thing to look for is the way that artists are playing with high and low culture. Specifically, you could think about that as like popular culture versus more like academic culture or style. And so this idea of shifting to believing that the everyday is just as valuable as the like fine, practical, like think of all like the balance and proportion and those aspects of like Renaissance art that we see in like the academies and in classical style. And there starts to be kind of a play and a shift with that and using just sort of this everyday, for example, you'll look at Andy Warhol's Marilyn diptych and he utilizes a photograph that he didn't even take and he just manipulates this image, this popular icon, to create his own works. Remember to acknowledge your own personal aesthetic. So this part I think can be super important with postmodernism. It's always really interesting to me because there's a tendency for most of you to either really connect with the aesthetics and ideals of the Renaissance era or postmodernism. Some of you might like a little of both, that's totally fine. But just be aware that you don't have to like every work that you see in order to engage with it well. And that once again, just like we did with the Renaissance era, we need to recognize our own lens, our own ideals, and our own preferences, especially aesthetically, and we need to be able to set those aside. The other thing you might need to set aside with postmodern art is a desire for what you see as like perceived technical skill in the work. Because there's such a shift in the way that artists are making and the materials that they're utilizing and the focus of the work and the way you interact with the work, so much is up and open for grabs in postmodernism. And something that can happen is that you look at that work and you feel like you could have created that work. And the argument of, well, you didn't, is not really a strong enough argument. What I would encourage you to think of instead is you're looking for technical skill. What kinds of skills and processes did those artists have to go through instead of maybe a technical skill to get the work that they had completed? So if that's a hang up for you with that technical ability, kind of reframe that question. So as we look at postmodern artwork, recognize you don't have to love it, or you can super be into it, either way, but make sure that you're still able to set your own lens aside and your own aesthetic preferences aside and ask those questions about who made the work, why did they make the work, what context, like what was happening at the time when they made the work, who else influenced the work, and ask those questions. And it's okay to say also, I don't enjoy this work. That's totally fine, but ask those further questions as well.